Credits. Some Star Wars characters got to have them, some really need them, and some do bad things both with and for them. But one thing I've always wondered is, how much is a credit really worth? How much do things cost? Do we ever really know what the average galactic citizen does with their money? To figure out at least some of these things, I looked through every Legends novel for every mention of credits related to the value of something which I could find, and the results will shock you. And not really, but they're kind of interesting at least. So for this, I specifically didn't look in source books or at video games because credits there are more about game mechanics than actually placing a relative value on ships and equipment or whatever else. And I also didn't look in canon novels because I already had well over 100 books to search just from Legends, and I don't have a lot of the newer canon books in ebook form, so I think I got the fundamentals from Legends at least. First, we know there are multiple types of credits. There are Imperial credits, Old Republic credits, Corellian credits, and so on. But there does never seem to be much focus on them having differing values. They simply get accepted or not, and it seems like a credit is worth a credit, unless something about the material makes them worth more. After Endor, for example, while the New Republic begins minting their own credits, Imperials will generally call that illegitimate and not accept them. But for situations where one credit might not actually equal one credit, different eras tended to have different types of credits being issued. The novel Rogue Planet refers to older Erodium minted credits, so basically credits made out of a different type of metal than the modern version. While we're not looking to sourcebooks for individual item values, the Rise of the Separatist RPG sourcebook refers to the Erodium Standard, setting up an intentional reference to the real-world historical gold standard formerly used to peg a currency's value to real gold. We actually see something similar to this in the canon show Skeleton Crew, where older Republic credits are of huge value. Credits typically come as little metal chits of widely varying values, some of which seem programmable, but they usually just are these little hunks of metal, sometimes worth 1 credit, but apparently sometimes worth 50,000 or more credits in one. But regardless of how the denominations are broken up, it all sounds kind of horrible to try to carry around and make change for. We do get at least one instance where the credits are in note form, but that's very much the exception. There are also other more local forms of currency around the galaxy. In episode 1, for example, you may remember Jar Jar being charged 7 Whoopie Whoopie and having no idea what that meant. It was in fact a type of currency used in generally Hutt-controlled Outer Rim territories like Tatooine, although the Hutts themselves tended to trade in every variety of currency they could get their hands on. And yes, don't worry, we eventually did find out some kind of exchange rate for Whoopie Whoopie. In the novel Scourge, set nearly 20 years after Yavin, we get this explanation of the Whoopie Whoopie. 16 Whoopie Whoopie to a Trugget, and 4 Truggets to a Pegget, which is worth 40 standard credits, so a Whoopie Whoopie would be worth about 2/3 of a credit. So that's all well and good, but what is a credit actually worth? It seems like in most cases, authors just treat one credit as basically being a dollar. This can be a US or Canadian dollar depending on where the author's from, or even a British pound. So that's not super exciting, but it can be useful to know, and there are some fun side facts which come with that. It does help things stay at least semi-consistent in universe too, rather than having people completely pull random numbers out when they want to give prices. The books are full of references to your standard $10 bets in the form of 10 credit bets. But we also have an instance where Jagged Fell asked Tahiri Vela what he calls the million credit question, which can only mean one thing, that Regis Philbin is canon, and has probably liked this video and subscribed for more. This is actually only one of at least 2 oblique references to there being a HoloNet show suspiciously close to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The other is in Shadow Games, where it's more loosely referred to as the big credit question. This framing actually gets to something else I find kind of interesting, which is how often authors will try to avoid giving an actual credit number, and I think it makes sense even if it wasn't super helpful in writing this video. Basically, if you give a number, you're kind of pegging prices to a specific point in time, and real-world inflation becomes a bigger factor than in-universe inflation. So what do I mean by that? Let's say we have 3 books. 2 are written in 2006. One is about 14 ABY, and one is about 4000 BBY. The third book is also set in 14 ABY, but was written in, let's say, 1970. Despite the fact that you'd think prices in universe would be closer in the 2 books set in 14 ABY, because the prices reflect real-world prices of the time, the books that are written closer together but set farther apart are going to have numbers that match more closely than 2 books that are set closer together but written far apart. In older books, for example, you tend to see more prices which involve decky credits or micro credits. But now, nothing costs less than $1, so you just don't see that anymore. A few things do remain consistent regardless. Ultimately, Star Wars novels are dealing with some of the richest people and groups in the galaxy, so most of the time, the value of whatever is happening is pegged at such ridiculously high numbers, they stay almost impressively consistent throughout the expanded universe. Based on what's actually explicitly priced out in books, though, there are 9 industries in Star Wars. There's travel and starship manufacturing, food and beverages, mercenary work including bounty hunting, healthcare, gambling, droid manufacturing, false IDs, and bribery. You could count that as 8 if you want to combine travel and starship manufacturing. A lot of these are fairly straightforward, though sadly few fit into our hopes of determining everyday costs. In that category, we mostly just have a few instances of people buying drinks and like one instance of buying food, along with healthcare, travel arrangements, and a time in Street of Shadows where a Toydarian offers one of the characters a fake ID for 4 credits, which to be fair does sound like a bargain. For food though, in Legacy of the Force, Ben Skywalker is able to get a Neelab stew for 10 credits, and an alcoholic drink called a Spun Fog Blaster for 8 credits. $20 at a pub for a drink and a meal isn't that far off of what I would expect to pay in the mid-2000s. In the MedStar duology, which is basically Star Wars MASH, the characters spend a lot of time in the pub after their shifts, and they end up being charged 17 credits for 4 alcoholic drinks, something which made a lot more sense in 2004 as well, but now would probably only cover one of those drinks if you're lucky. It's also possible those drinks were in some way subsidized for being part of a military base, which must also be the case on the Death Star, where you could get a 2-credit ale. When they were visiting the Killiks for the first time in the Dark Nest Crisis Joiner King from around 2005, Luke tries to take out 10 credits to pay for 2 drinks before being told they didn't have to pay, instead of being laughed at for thinking 10 credits could buy 2 drinks. I mean, I'm also Canadian, so to be fair, I'm also not entirely sure what American prices look like now, and I was 12 in 2004, so I wasn't drinking all that heavily yet and have even less of an idea back then. But moving on, travel is also more of an everyday person expense, and we have some pretty consistent prices for that throughout the years, helped along by having the baseline of Han's fee in Episode 4, which we are intended to understand is hugely inflated, given how desperate Han knows Ben and Luke are, the difficulty involved, and the lack of a desire for Imperial entanglements. There are a lot of references to travel costing more the farther you want to go, and the more private you want to be, but usually interstellar travel seems to cost in the range of 2,000 credits to 10,000 credits, although the cheapest we see is from Tales of the Bounty Hunters, where Dengar gives Manaru, quote, a few hundred credits to buy her passage wherever. If you wanted to get your own spaceship, prices tend to be roughly equivalent to what you might expect for a slightly higher range car a couple decades ago. In the Old Republic books, we get references to about 40,000 credits for one of the ships, 50,000 for another, which seems to be on par for other non-military ships we hear about in other books. For military craft, including starfighters, you get to the order of millions of credits, which is kind of funny given that in a lot of cases, we see that private starships are bigger and better armed and equipped than most individual fighters. Star Destroyers get referred to as multi-billion credit vessels, and then in the novel Death Star, the Death Star itself is referred to as a multi-trillion credit project. I wanted to say dollar there. To put that figure in context, the Old Republic's budget is described in Republic Commando True Colors as being on the order of high quadrillions to low quintillions of credits. Although to put it even more in context, if you want individual characters to be described as rich as possible, Karen Travis's novels tend to be the place to go, so everything there feels a little bit inflated. Even if that number for the budget kind of feels low for the whole galaxy. Boba Fett eventually ends up with enough credits to cover the GDP of multiple planets if not sectors, and Cal Scarata, one of the Mandalorian trainers of the clones in her other novels, is described as a trillionaire. But sticking with travel expenses, aside from the cost of actually traveling or owning a ship, docking expenses and other administrative fees were usually put at around 50 credits on the low end to 200 credits in some of the higher end instances. The biggest outlier we get on any of this is in the book Rogue Planet, which has special living ships where one cost about 6 billion credits for Cinar to acquire, which was heavily damaged and not particularly big. This is also a book where Obi-Wan and Anakin are traveling with 3 billion credits worth of donations made to the Jedi Order, so it's possible that the book had a very different idea of how much money was worth than other places. These living ships were very special and very important though. The final thing that we'll talk about which gets close to being part of an average citizen's budget, I guess aside from gambling if you want to count that, is healthcare. This probably deserves its own video, but healthcare is both private and very expensive seemingly. Han needs some back to salve and gets shaken down for 100 credits for it, which is nothing compared to some of the other numbers we see. In Millennium Falcon, someone's medical costs are described as having been 10,000 credits over the course of a few years, but we're also told costs vary significantly depending on where you are. On another planet, the same care would have been more than that per month. Care for the elderly could similarly be exorbitantly expensive, with a 90,000 credit deposit being put down for the care of Augusta Yacht at the Geridard Convalescent Center, which was basically a space retirement home. The kind of price variance is something that we also see in other industries, which makes sense given how varied a place the galaxy is. When it comes to food and drink, for example, Obi-Wan was charged 10 credits for a water refill on Tatooine in the Dark Lord trilogy just after Episode 3. Back to healthcare though, we're not given any specific numbers here, but we do also know from Tales of the Bounty Hunters that Boba Fett was being bankrupted by his cancer treatments. In fact, despite his later riches, according to the stories in the books of the late 90s, Boba wasn't exactly rolling in it during the original trilogy, and he was still one of the more successful bounty hunters. Over time, a lot of the bounty hunters do get treated as being much richer. One important note with healthcare though is that we're dealing with people who are typically either very rich or very much on the fringes of society, so Boba, being a bounty hunter, might not want to go through traditional channels for healthcare. Droids are often described as being even more expensive than starships. In the New Rebellion, 3PO notes that as a functional package, he's worth 43,000 credits, compared to 5,000 as a pile of scrap. And a special Force-sensitive droid type from the Cestus Deception, made out of essentially living circuitry and different from Rogue Planet's living ships, therefore seems like a bit of a steal at its described price of 80,000 credits. When it comes to bribery, mercenary work, bounty hunting, and gambling, the prices are kind of all over the map. Boba says that the highest bounty he's ever heard of in the Tales series during the Galactic Civil War is about 5 million credits, but we get mentions of bounties being as low as 1,000 credits, and in the case of the main heroes of the original trilogy, their bounty posted by the Empire tends to vary a bit, but it's usually in the ballpark of 1 to 200,000 credits per person. Jedi were being hunted under the Empire with a 50,000 credit offer per Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. But in general, the 50,000 credit bounty figure seems to get used quite a bit for anyone an author wants to make seem at least somewhat important. Jabba offered a 50,000 credit bounty on Chewbacca, although he was going to try to con whoever took that out of 25,000 credits. So generally, if you want a nice, respectable, lower tier bounty, 10 to 15,000 credits is about where most books land. If you're trying to hire someone for a dangerous job, prices could vary from 3,000 credits to 50,000 credits or more, with the Mandalorians charging Corellia 1 million credits per person per month during the Second Galactic Civil War, because they're just that worthwhile or something. There are so many different instances of all this that it's hard for me to give specific examples and not feel like I'm just kind of leaving out too much information by focusing on those specific examples. And gambling is where things naturally vary the most. A lot of gambling sessions we see stay in the lower stakes games, a few credits per hand, but we also see plenty of stories with 10,000 credit buy-ins or higher, and anything with Lando gets particularly high. In The Adventures of Lando Calrissian from 1994, he's regularly in games where he's making tens or even hundreds of thousands of credits per game, because again, these are some of the richest people in the universe. But again, going into too much detail on the gambling is just going to sound like a bunch of random numbers, and nothing there is particularly unrealistic either. Once you have rich people money, it still makes perfect sense for them to be throwing around millions of credits on these games, and it still tells us nothing about the state of the overall Star Wars economy. One industry that I kind of left out earlier is the art industry. This kind of fits into the same realm, though, where it doesn't tell us too much about the overall state of the galactic economy or what people would experience in their everyday lives. There are a lot of stories, including Killick Twilight by Troy Denning, where we're dealing with multi-million credit art pieces, and there are some instances where the art pieces get into the hundreds of millions of credits. That's going to do it for our look at the Star Wars economy for today, though. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.